they live and work and conduct scientific research to answer these questions and many more like them. They are scientists, but also construction workers and technicians, repairmen and teachers, cleaners and cooks.
This is the real thing. I'm Gene Sergeant, Apollo astronaut. It is with great pride and pleasure that I welcome you on this tour. What makes the Johnson Space Center special is that the elite men and women who go into space work live and dream. What makes us successful is the teaming.
Liquid nitrogen tanks you can see to your left. They're just peering over the wall. We use the liquid nitrogen to simulate the atmosphere of space. All the canisters and tanks here have a nitrogen that is utility liquid of 320 degrees below.
The elevator will be directly behind the stairwell, and it's to your right now. When we get upstairs to the Apollo Mission Control Room, you can take any row that you want to sit in, but you got to move all the way down to the left side of that row. Leave no spaces in between groups, because we want to get as many people in a seat as possible. All right, for everyone going up the stairs, just please follow me at this time.
I got it.
One missions to space between 1965 and 1992. In 1992, this room was decommissioned and we opened up a more modern mission control. When this was closed down, what we did with everything in here, the consoles, the seats, the carpet, everything, we sent it to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. And then in 1999, we asked for it back, we got it back, and we set it up just like it was in 1965. So, everything in here is the original. This is 1965 for all intents and purposes. And your first indication of that, by the way, was when you sat in these nice, comfortable chairs. They don't make them like that anymore. Another indication of the 60s, those sitting in rows 2 through 5, the seat backs in front of you have these little metal things on them. Those are called ashtrays. Okay? Yeah. You don't see that anymore. And the last thing I'll point out from the 60s, other than me, would be in the back of the room. There's 2 doors on each side that are illuminated. Those are called phone booths. Okay? For the youngsters in here, ask mom and dad later on what a phone booth is. Okay? So that's just a little bit of leftovers we have from the 60s. Just kind of give you the, it is the originals. This room that you're sitting in is called the viewing area. Typically, who would be in here during the mission? Everybody wants to know who was in here. Okay. Typically, it would be the families of the astronauts. We're always welcomed in here 24/7. There was always an attendant here. We've had United States presidents from, Lyndon Johnson to George Bush. We've had Queen Elizabeth here in the front row. We've had politicians. I almost called them actors. We've had politicians in and out of here, unfortunately. But anyway, so we've had a lot of different people. We have had actors, actually. As a matter of fact, probably the most recognizable actor we've had in here, you might recognize it, a fellow named Tom Hanks. He was the latest one we had here, and Tom Hanks was he was in here for about a week and a half, and Tom Hanks actually sat out there where y'all are sitting. I don't know if anybody has any idea why Tom Hanks would sit out there. Exactly, yes. He liked my presentation. All right, and Apollo 13 too. Actually, they wanted to film Apollo 13 in here, but it wasn't big enough, as you all can attest to. It's not too big in here. They couldn't get the cameras around here, so they went back to Hollywood and recreated all this. So if you've seen the movie Apollo 13, you'll swear this is what you saw in the movie. It's not. It was a Hollywood set. And if you've seen the movie again, you might think they had a couple shots of the viewing area. You might think, oh yeah, it's not. It was a Hollywood set. So anyway, just a little tidbit there. Alrighty. What we're going to do now is I'm going to take you in the room a little bit, point out a few things to you, kind of give you an idea, a feel for what it was like. The first thing I'll call your attention to is the consoles that you see in front of you have these little square black monitors. A lot of folks think that maybe it's an old-fashioned computer. Well, it's not. It's not even that. It is basically a data monitor. They used to get data that would roll over there in green. There was no computers in Mission Control in '65 when we opened up. We had two computers back then. One was a backup, and then one they actually used for the space program. And back then in '65, it was a state-of-the-art computer. It was an IBM mainframe 360 computer. Probably no one in here is old enough to see one, but if you ever watched the History Channel, you might have seen one. It was as large as this room. We had it in the basement. Took 10 people to operate it, and had a whopping 5 megabytes of memory. Yeah, it's laughable now to think that's all we had to get man into space, but that is all we had. As a matter of fact, you folks out there with your cell phones on you right now, you have more technology in your phones than we had during the Apollo missions when we put man on the moon. So again, it's a tribute to the brilliant young folks that worked in here, and we'll talk about them a little bit later. But again, they accomplished a lot with very little. With the aid of a graphic designer, would design their own plaque. They're all different because the plaque reflects the objectives of each mission. That's why they're all different. The only similarity they have is somewhere on the plaque, there's the astronaut's name that was on that mission. And what would happen is they designed the plaque. Before they went off into space, they'd give it to the flight director, the person that was in charge. He would then mount it on the left-hand wall, right over here. After the mission got back to Earth safe and sound, they'd have a ceremony of sorts, and they would mount it on the right-hand wall. So if you get in there, you'll count 41 of them. Now, I'll just call your attention to this one right here. That's about the most historic one in there. That's the first one they handled in mission control. That was Gemini 4 back in 1965. It's also historic because of this fellow right here, astronaut Ed White. He was on board Gemini 4, and astronaut Ed White was the first United States astronaut to walk in space. And he set a record. He was out there for 22 minutes. Back then, that was a long time. Today's standards, it's nothing. So anyway, that's a little bit about that. The flag that you see right there, that little story behind that, that has actually been to the moon and back twice. That was a backup flag. NASA always had backup. So one of the things we did when we went to the moon was we always put the United States flag on the moon first thing. And NASA wanted to make sure that we had a flag that worked. So they said, well, what if the original one didn't work? We need a backup. So that's why we had 2 of them. So again, that's been on 2 missions, got about over 1 million miles on it right now. Alright, what I'm going to do now, or try to do here, is talk about a couple of different positions in here. Again, try to give you a feel for what the people did in here back then. The first one I'll mention is the spacecraft communicator. The spacecraft communicator is the only person in a mission control that talks to the astronauts when they're in space, and that's by design. The spacecraft communicator is always an astronaut, always has been, always will be. Now, the reason why they have an astronaut at this communicator's desk, and the reason why he's the only one, several reasons, and I'll tell you. Number one, he is trained with the other astronauts, so he knows them personally. He's familiar with the spacecraft. Probably most important is that he knows the astronaut language. Astronauts talk differently than any person in this room. They use a lot of acronyms, they use a lot of technical terms, and a lot of abbreviations. They never say a complete word, they always condense it. So what they say back and forth to each other in 5 minutes would take one of the other guys probably an hour to say. So it's a real time effective position, and it works. We had this 50 years ago when we opened up. We just opened up Mission Control about a month ago, and we still have a spacecraft communicator, and it's still an astronaut. So it works, they're not going to change it. Next position we'll talk about, if we go back 1 row to the flight director, right there. Now the flight director right there, he is the one that is in charge of the mission. He has the responsibility of making every major decision in there. When they're on a mission, if there's a decision to be made, if there's a problem, he's the one that handles it. He is in charge. No one does argue with him, no one will quibble. And no one can override him. So when they're on a mission, it's his mission, his call. It's, again, a very responsible type position for sure. This was pioneering days, if you would. So they were very inquisitive. And also we had military missions and we had civilian missions. So he would update them on all of what was going on. His other major function was actually right here. It was a good timing here. His other major function was when the astronauts came to Earth, they didn't land on a runway like they do nowadays. They would float to Earth in a capsule with 3 or 4 parachutes and splash down in the Pacific. What his job was, he'd pick up the red phone, call the Department of the Navy, speak to some admiral, and say, okay, here's the coordinates where they're splashing down, send an aircraft carrier, send helicopters, rescue the astronauts, and pick up the capsule and bring them home. And that's exactly what they did. And that was good timing too. But anyway, that's what he did over there. Let me see here. Well, let's talk about one more. Okay, we're going to go right here to the Public Affairs Officer. This desk right here. This actually could be called the media desk, if you would. He was in charge of, anything to do with the media. Press conferences, press releases, questions from the news media. His most important function was he would coordinate what the feeds that he would give the major TV networks. Back then, they would give clips that shows, them taking off, landing, walking on the moon, etc. He was in charge of supplying the 4 major TV networks all of the footage they need. Now, back then, the 4 screens represent the 4 major networks we had. We only had ABC, CBS, NBC, and PBS. There was no Fox, no CNN, no MSNBC, no live internet feed. Life was simple in the 60s, so anyway. All right, so that pretty much does it. I'll just wrap it up by saying without what these brilliant young pioneers did in here, we would not have our space program as we know it today. And let me step back. I said brilliant young pioneers. They were young. The average age of the worker in here at that time was 26 years old. Incredible, yes. The flight director, the one with all the responsibility, they used to call him the old man. He was 31. So, again.
For spacewalks. A partnership of 16 nations from international space agencies provide and operate the elements of the ISS. The principals of these space agencies are the United States, Russia, Europe, Japan, and Canada. The ISS has been the largest peacetime collaborative effort ever undertaken. If you look directly in front of the Zarya module, you'll see a green spherical capsule. And this is the Russian Soyuz capsule and our current transportation up to the International Space Station. So as of August of 2011, NASA has not had their own vehicle to transport our astronauts to the ISS. So what we've been doing since then and currently is taking taxi rides via this very spacecraft.